So, Israel Ambassador to Sweden, Ilan Ben-Dov, thank you so much for speaking with us today at the Smort Snack podcast that is produced by Heavenbound Ministries. Many people who listen to this podcast have a big interest in the nation of Israel. So I'm glad that you would join us today, that we would get a clearer picture of the relationship between our two great nations.
Thank you so much for having me in your podcast, and happy to be with you, with your viewers, and looking forward to an interesting meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to start to ask you a little bit about yourself. Could you just in short tell us a little bit about your background, what city you grew up in, what university you attended, and what the political post you had prior to coming to Sweden?
Yes, okay. I was born and I grew up in Tel Aviv. I'm married to Roni, whom I met in Jerusalem. That's another interesting story. We are parents of 3 children, a daughter and 2 boys. They are all in Israel. And as I said, I grew up in Tel Aviv. I did my BA in the Bar Ilan University, and then my master's degree in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And just a few years after university, I joined the Israeli Foreign Service as a cadet, immediately, as I said, after the university. And then I began from, a junior diplomat and all through the years until I became ambassador. Most of the years I was dealing with European affairs. I spent also 4 years as ambassador to Singapore, which is not in Europe, of course, but most of my professional career, as I said, is in Europe, in Central and Western Europe, both at the headquarters in Jerusalem, and I served also in our embassy in Germany. I speak German, so I was sent. We were sent twice to German-speaking countries, first to Germany, then to Austria, and here I am trying to represent my country in the wonderful Sweden.
So that's great. So you started with Germany and Austria, and now you went to the Northern Germanic people, Swedish.
Indeed. It's a bit different, but it's a great challenge and very interesting.
That we're happy to have you, and so I would just like to explore a little bit of the history of our nations before coming onto speaking about the present and about the present and about the future. So me personally, I'm a little bit more right-leaning politically, and Sweden have predominantly been ruled by the Social Democratic Party. And I have for a long time wondered why sometimes the Social Democratic Party have a negative connotation when it comes to the country Israel, or sometimes a negative attitude, often also in the media that are left-leaning. It have been reported, in my opinion, in a very unfair manner. So in order to understand more, I actually picked up this book from the library that is called Israel and Palestine, 60 Years in Our Red Hearts, by Ulf Biereld and Ulf Karmesund. And this is written by different social democratic thought leaders. And on the front cover, there is a picture of Tage Erlander and Ben Gurion. And you can see it right here. So,
I know, I've seen the picture, of course, yes.
yes, so let me ask you, how was the relationship between Israel and Sweden in these times, let's say the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, um, that's an interesting development that we have seen. By the way, I have to, of course, underline, I hope it is obvious that I, as an Israeli diplomat, I'm not representing any political party. I represent the state of Israel, and I'm not in any way politically involved in the sense of party politics. So I do not represent neither someone from the oh, I'm sorry.
No problem.
From the left parties or a, let me just silence my telephone. But having said that, the beginning was very positive. I'm speaking now about the 50s and the 60s. You mentioned Erlander, and then the relations began as very, not only positive but close and intimate political relations and a great friendship. And it was not only because of the fact that both Israel and Sweden were dominated by a social democratic a party, but I think that it went much beyond. And as I said, there was a close friendship between even the unions, the LO, and the Israeli Histadrut, and of course the kibbutz movement that was playing a very dominant role in the Israeli society, in Israeli culture, and in the Israeli economy. And so politically, there were also very close relations. And the famous meeting between Erlander and Ben-Gurion was only a symbol of a sign of that friendship. Yes, yeah.
Very good. And the second picture on the front cover of this book is in 1983, when Yasser Arafat visited Stockholm, and he was received by Olof Palme, our late prime minister. And how did Israel view Sweden receiving the leader of PLO in such an early time to Stockholm as we did? Did it affect the relationship in a good or bad way? Do you remember how it was talked about?
Yeah, of course. That was a turning point, a very, very negative turning point. And I don't know, or I'm not an expert to the ideology and the motives of Palme, but what I do know as an Israeli, and what everybody should know, is that Yasser Arafat was the inventor and the leader of modern international terrorism. Yasser Arafat was responsible for the murder of thousands and thousands of Israelis, for atrocities and attacks against Israeli civilians. He was the amalgamation, he was the symbol of international terrorism. And I have to admit that until now, I don't understand what made Olof Palme then meet him. But that was certainly a turning point. Yasser Arafat never accepted the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East, and he was not man of peace, and there was no reason to accept him as a guest in Stockholm.
So we're gonna come back to what you mentioned about that he never confessed a Jewish state in the Middle East, but let's just hold that for later. And I'm gonna ask you about in 1977, Menachem Begin was elected the Prime Minister of Israel. And in the decade prior, a lot of Jews had immigrated from the Soviet Union. Now, these had a very negative connotation to the word socialism and even the word social democracy. They didn't really like that type of word. So this put together made Israel go a little bit more right-leaning, you could say, since Begin was more right-leaning himself. And before, as you mentioned, it had been known a lot for its labor movement, the kibbutz movement, and so on. And the interesting thing is that while this happened in 1977, the heavy critique started to rain in from Sweden onto Israel. So what my question to you is the critique from Sweden to Israel really against Israel, or is it against the right political parties in Israel?
No, I think that the development was much more complex than this. We should not only concentrate on the fact that there was a change of government in Israel. And by the way, also the change in Israel in May 1977, it was the first time when the Israeli labor movement has lost elections, and Menachem Begin became prime minister. But that is as a phenomenon that we see in every democracy. Once you have this party, and the other time you have another party. So the reason for the change in the bilateral relations between Sweden and Israel might be that it was, among other reasons, that was it, but it was not only this. And by the way, also the shift in Israel was not only motivated by the fact that, or influenced by the fact that, by the fact that we had a large immigration from the former Soviet Union, or then it was still the Soviet Union, 1977. That has influenced, but the reason for Israel becoming less social democratic and more capitalistic, if you want, even in the structure of the economy, or the character of the economy, that had many other reasons, and not only, it was not only influenced by the immigration from the Soviet Union, but yes, indeed, through the years, Israel's economy became much less social democratic and much more, or a bit more, capitalistic, although even today it is a capitalistic society or capitalistic economy based on the idea of a welfare state. Like many other Western European economies and societies, where you have a free market and a capitalistic market, but based on a welfare state, and so that was the major shift in Israel.
I see, and the reason why I'm a little bit staying on this subject is because while reading some of the literature from the social democratic thought leaders, it's pretty apparent that as long as a country have a labor party, that is the party that they want to collaborate with. And this is even later in the book. I won't mention too much about it in the interview, but this was the thoughts that went on with first the PLO, that they are gonna be like collaborating with the Fatah labor unions, and also that later on that Hamas would be a labor party. And because of this, they are writing, we have to try to find some kind of a way to always collaborate worldwide with labor movements. So sometimes I believe it's good to also understand the intentions, and to understand how could they invite Yasser Arafat back then. Well, there is an explanation, and some of it might be in the worldwide international labor movement.
Yeah, well, that brings me back to my education as a political scientist. Yes, but I believe that relations among nations, between nations, yes, of course, they're influenced by the fact that who is your counterpart and what is his ideologic a background, and if he is, but I believe that in democracies, and we've seen this all over Europe, yes. I don't think that there is a big change in the relations between Sweden and, I don't know, Germany, Belgium, the United Kingdom, if the government party is, if the government is social democratic, or labor in the case of the United Kingdom, or conservatives. But yes, I believe, again, I'm not an expert to Olof Palme, and I'm not an expert to, though I try to learn and to understand the Swedish Social Democrats. But as far as I have learned, yes, there was this tendency by Palme to meet, so-called socialistic revolutionary leaders in Africa and in South America, and in this respect,
right.
But the PLO had nothing to do with socialism, and the PLO had only one agenda on its in its ideology, and this is to ruin, to destroy the state of Israel, and to build another Arab country instead of it, in what they call Palestine, and that had nothing to do with socialism, let alone later on. That was, of course, after the time of Palme. Let alone a terrorist organization like Hamas, which is a radical Islamistic organization that contradicts everything that you can think about social democracy. It's a very religious, Islamistic, violent terrorism, a terrorist organization that has nothing whatsoever to do with social democracy.
I totally agree with you, but some of these thinkers and writers say that all the same, the Hamas was elected in parts of Palestine in political elections. So if this is the parties or the group that they want to be ruled by, we have to reach out. And me personally have a different view, as I also hear that you have, but they are always thinking about collaboration, no matter how bad the actors might be.
Well, everybody has his, his moral decisions and political decisions, and I know even the government, the Swedish current government does not have any relations to Hamas, because they well understand that Hamas is an organization that has only um, one purpose or one target, and this is to destroy the state of Israel. And they are motivated by jihad, by an Islamistic holy war, and their aspiration is to export the Islamic revolution, and that will start as they are dreaming in what they call Palestine, but it will follow, of course, also to Europe. So this is, I believe, well understood also in Sweden. And
That's
Sweden,
good to hear that this have been coming to the political leaders' attention, and that they are acting in a responsible manner upon it. So let me ask you, in 1988, then Foreign Minister Sten Andersson started to negotiate with Israel, America, and Palestine, and he asked the United States what was needed in order for them to start negotiating with PLO at this time. The answer was clearly recognize Israel as a state and also end the terrorism. The same year, Yasser Arafat confessed and recognized Israel as a state, and he condemned terrorism. But my question to you is, did he really confess Israel as a state? And did he really condemn terrorism? Because this is something that we are always told that he did here in Sweden, and we celebrate that our foreign minister had this great political victory. But was this really a political victory or not?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, beyond his declaration, or beyond every other political declaration, you should very well observe what is he doing and what is the message that he is conveying, or that he was conveying then, not in Stockholm or in Brussels or in New York, but at home, at the mosques of Gaza and at the mosques of Ramallah. And there he spoke completely different, in a different manner, in a different way. Just as an example to illustrate, yes, if you look at the flag of the PLO until today, the state of Israel, they have a map there, and the state of Israel simply doesn't exist. If you check the textbooks of Palestinian schools in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, then there is a state of Palestine. Israel simply does not exist. So he may have said something which was considered here as a recognition, but even later on, unfortunately, even we Israelis were hoping that he would accept the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East, the state of Israel, as the homeland of the Jewish people. And he never did this. He never did this. Again, we are following, and it's not only Arafat, we are following the Palestinians, and we listen to what they say, as I said, not in the European capital cities and not in New York, but to their own people. Right. And there you see no recognition of the state of Israel.
That's interesting to hear. So let me ask you on a little bit more positive note, maybe. How was the relationship between Sweden and Israel during the Göran Persson era, when he was the Swedish Prime Minister?
Well, that's indeed positive. I think that Mr. Persson had a very good understanding of the Middle East, of the state of Israel. He is a friend of the state of Israel, and I believe that I would like to see that his perception and his policy above all will be continued. And that brings us also, but I suppose we will speak about it later, to current affairs.
Yes.
I believe that things can be improved, but during his time, I think that he had, I know that he had a very, very deep historic understanding and a very wide and deep understanding of Jewish history, of the state of Israel, and above all of the Middle East. And during his time, the relations were good.
So maybe it is like you say, it would be very good if the thoughts that that school of thought that Göran Persson had would maybe start being implemented even more today, or maybe it is. We're gonna come to that a little bit later. But let me just ask you something else here. So let me preference this with, this is not the official standpoint of the Social Democratic Party today, but this is from some of their thought leaders in the book also. And it was written around 2008, 2010 or so. So maybe some things have changed in their vision, but all the same, back then they wrote a few of their suggestions that they had, their vision that they had for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm just going to mention 3 of them and hear your reaction to it. So one of the proposals is a two-state solution according to the borders of 1967. Secondly, that the occupation ends, that the settlement politic ends, that the wall built on occupied territory is torn down, and that the road checkpoints ends. Number 3, that the violence ends from both sides. So what do you think of the rhetoric in these proposals using words like occupy and occupation? Is it fair? Why or why not? And in general, what do you think of these proposals? Are they fair or not fair? Are they good or not good?
Yeah. First of all, I would advise the people who wrote this to be a little bit more humble and to understand that peace between Israelis and the Arabs, or Israelis and the Palestinians, will not be exactly decided among the Social Democratic Party, with all due respect, yes, in Sweden and not in Stockholm. So a little bit of being humble will not harm anyone. This is, of course, a description or a position which is unfortunately for many years now in certain circles among the, well, let's call it center left parties in Sweden, very one-sided, very biased, very against Israel. Let me refer only to one example. They speak a lot about occupation, so-called occupation. Yes, this is an absurd. This is just to remind us all that until 1967, until the Six-Day War, there was no 1 inch of so-called occupation, and there we didn't see any Arab intention or any Arab willingness to live in peace with Israel. So the Arab total rejection of the very existence of the state of Israel, which is, by the way, now beginning to change, but then the total rejection of the very idea of the existence of Israel was totally rejected long before we have what they call occupation. So let us remind ourselves that the problem among the core, the reason, the key to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not a so-called occupation, but the question whether the Palestinians or the Arab nations accept the existence of the State of Israel or not. It has nothing to do with so-called occupation. If you want, I can also refer to the very use of the word, because this terminology is being used by certain Swedish politicians until today. You know, it's a sort of a mantra. They always speak about occupation.
Yes.
They tend to forget that this so-called occupation was born after several Arab countries have begun a war against Israel. In June 1967, Israel went to defend itself, and it won the war. And this is how what they call occupation was born. It's you know, the very I would say wrong way to blame Israel for occupation, in which people tend to forget who started the war, who went to war in June 1967, and to try and present this, and there is a lot of hypocrisy here, to try and present this as if in June 1967, on a certain morning, Israel had nothing better to do than occupied Arab territories. This is, of course, a distortion of history, and
Yes.
and it is utterly wrong. We defended ourselves in a war of defense against the wish of the then president of Egypt, Jamal Abdel Nasser, which sent his army to attack Israel in order to destroy it. These are the historic facts, and people tend to forget them.
That's true, and I like how you put it. It's like distortion of history, because many times I could just give it from my subjective perspective. Growing up in Sweden, it's often in different ways presented to you as if Israel just woke up one morning deciding to go in and occupy territory just for the love of it. And the reason really was them being attacked, defending themselves, and every sovereign nation have a right to defend itself and its borders and its population.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that even today, very senior Swedish politicians, including Foreign Minister Linde, with whom we have a very good dialogue, you know, but they use this mantra, you know, this slogan of occupation, as if the so-called occupation is the reason for the conflict in the Middle East. Well, it is certainly not. And one has to be very, very careful and accurate while speaking about historical facts.
Yes. Thank you for setting the record straight, Mr. Ambassador. So let me ask you, how are the relationships between Sweden and Israel today, and how do they look for the future when it comes to trade, collaborations, etc.?
Yeah, well, I have to say that I'm very optimistic. I see a beginning of change and improvement. This has got many reasons, but in a nutshell, to describe it, I believe that generation of the political generation of the hardcore of those who are against Israel and were leading the anti-Israeli, very biased politics. I think that they are beginning to politically disappear. And I speak with many young people here in Sweden, and I see that there is much among the young generation, much more understanding of the situation of Israel as the only democratic state in the Middle East, as a small island of democracy, which is surrounded by Islamistic fundamentalism and violence. And I believe that among the young generation, there is a much better understanding of Israel. This is one thing. And the other thing is, and you mentioned it, people understand that Israel, or the story of Israel, is not only the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Israel is, as I said, the only democracy in the Middle East. It's a vibrant society. It's an open society. It is an economy based on innovation, on know-how. It is based on the human resource. We have some of the best universities in the world. We have a very dynamic economy, which is, by the way, very much similar to the Swedish economy. And we see more and more cooperation between Swedish companies and Israeli companies, between the universities. And I believe that among the young generation, there is a much better understanding that Israel is a success story, and that Israel is much more than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Yes.
It is an interesting society. It is an advanced society, an open one, and a very vibrant one.
That's very true, and I actually visited Israel together with my friend who have traveling agency called Due School Traveling Agencies, and it was the first time I visited. I actually went there maybe just a few months before the coronavirus started to happen, so I was happy that I actually had the experience before all of the world started to shut down, from being able to fly and being able to tour and all of this. So let me ask you a bonus question. Israel have vaccinated a big part of its population already. And when do you think it will be open for tourism and traveling again, so that people could visit and see what you are mentioning right here? And that I could totally agree with, that Israel is such a exciting country.
Yeah, first of all, I wish to myself that as many Swedes will indeed arrive to Israel to witness with their own eyes the wonderful country. And by the way, many of them have already visited it. We had until Corona, until the beginning of the epidemic, we had in the last years very sharp rise in tourism from Sweden to Israel, almost 30% rise in the in tourism, because people simply enjoy the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Tiberias, and Eilat, and that is also very important, positive development. So I'm sure that will continue. We are very successful in quite fast process of to immune the society. We have succeeded also already to vaccination of more than 50% of the population. But unfortunately, we are trying now very gradually to open up the economy. It will take time. Of course, it's not only we are living in a global world, so what is happening in Israel is not isolated from what is happening in other places. So we need the whole world to be there and to vaccinate as fast as it can. I certainly hope, no one knows, but I certainly hope that in the foreseeable future, it will be possible to somehow gradually go back to a normal life, the life that we had before Corona.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for the great work that you do. We are grateful to have you in Sweden, and thank you for speaking with us today at the Smort Snack podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, for hosting me. It was a pleasure. I know, having said all what we said, I know that Israel has many, many dedicated friends here, and we appreciate the friendship to Israel. We cherish it very much, and thank you.
Thank
And
you
shalom.
so much. Shalom.